Now, tonight's speaker is Jack Waterford AM, the editor-at-large, and that might be the first question, the editor-at-large of the Canberra Times. And tonight he's talking about 40 years of hard labour, or 40 years on the campaign trail. Basically reflections from someone who's covered politics from up close for a very long time. So please join me in welcoming Jack Waterford.
When we come to questions, incidentally, there's no need to confine yourself to anything that I've said. Anything sort of particularly outrageous that I've said or written over the years, I'm also sort of fairly happy to sort of chat about. I was 18 when I came to Canberra.
Close the Jack.
Yeah. I was 18 when I came to Canberra, and I was already quite interested in and absorbed by politics. It was 40 years ago that I became editor of the student magazine Waroni, and 41 years ago that I began working at the Canberra Times. I was nearly 21 when I saw my first Labor government elected. I was not all that awfully much older, probably 26, when I wondered if I'd ever see a Labor government elected again. In fact, of the last 42 years or so, it's actually been evenly divided between Labor and the Liberal Party. But I can say that I've had the privilege mostly, sometimes the onerous duty, of watching reasonably close up every change of government that has occurred in my lifetime. And I've known, not necessarily intimately or personally, but sort of professionally and otherwise, most of the major figures involved in politics and sense some of the excitement of it. I'm not going to make any sort of plea for the good old days versus today, or argue that one generation is better than another. But I was a person who was uncommonly blessed by the time that I was born. I'm a classic baby boomer person. My parents had suffered during the Depression. My father, who was a Changi prisoner of war, had suffered during the war. But I was one of a family of 8 that grew up in reasonably comfortable circumstances. I went to fine boarding schools because there were no other better schools about, but I'd grown up on a sheep property in western New South Wales. And I had some reasonable familiarity with the life of country towns, with the situation of Aboriginal people and other things which I think have sort of served me well over the years and given me interests which have sustained me quite a bit during my life. I was growing up in a period unknown previously in Australia, in which a majority of the people had not known war and not known depression, and did not have that hanging over them in the terrible way that it hung over the generation of my parents and generations before them. And that of itself helped spur a feeling that was perfectly obvious, say, by 1965, when I was still quite young, which was about our current society, our current circumstances, our increasing security of life, of is that all there is? Now, the political expression of that tended to be, well, what are we doing about Aborigines? What about the White Australia policy? Where does Australia stand in the world, and where does Australia stand with its neighbours? It manifested itself, if you like, in an increasingly more militant questioning and aggressive sort of analysis that was part of, if you like, the 60s revolt or the student generation, but also acquired for some of us, if you like, a bit of a selfish edge over issues such as conscription. I was a draft dodger. Over issues such as the war in Vietnam, which I opposed quite apart from the fact that I didn't particularly want to go and fight in it. And over matters such as justice for Aborigines, which have never figured on the political radar in Australia until the late 1960s, and over issues such as apartheid in South Africa. But well before that had reached any sort of electric stage, Gough Whitlam had seized a mood. And he'd seized a mood in a way that I think sometimes the politicians could study well today, and particularly, if you like, from a bit of a Canberra angle. The 1966 election was a terrible disaster for Labor. In fact, it was a disaster probably greater than the one we're going to have later on this year, if that is possible. The Labor Party was absolutely decimated. Safe Labor seats that had been held for years collapsed, and people sort of wondered whether the party could ever rise again or rise in anything like its traditional shape. Around about that time, Arthur Calwell retired, Whitlam came in and immediately began the work not just of reorganising the Labor Party, a battered and defeated Labor Party, but of devising fresh policies and energising Labor constituencies and, if you like, the Australian intelligentsia about it. One incident of that was that he sought really hard to get the Australian University involved in the policy formulation process. We didn't have Australia Institutes then, we didn't have think tanks or anything much in that thing, but there was this vast repository of talent in the universities and elsewhere that had long been discussing issues such as housing policy, social welfare policy and so forth. They had well-established criticisms of political processes and the way things were, but which had never really well connected into politics. There were people around, still about, but like Paddy Troy, who, if you like, helped make those sorts of links. But this was a period, as I say, in 1966 Labor was at its lowest ebb. In the 2 years after 1966, Labor, the membership of the Labor Party increased by about 200%. And in 1969, Labor very nearly won power after its most colossal defeat. In fact, when people talk of 1972 as, if you like, the time of change, nearly all of the work that was achieved in 1972 had been done by Gough Whitlam and, I suppose, in particular, Mick Young in 1969. I just interpolate here parenthetically that this was a situation that Don Watson talked about a few years ago in the wake of all of the inquests over the 2001 fiasco, when Labor made its little compromise with the opinion polls over the Tampa affair and refugee policy, and justified it on the basis that they just had to go that way even if they morally disagreed with it, because damn it all, that was what the electorate thought. After the debacle, there was the inevitable inquest and the inevitable group of wise men to come around and write a report which is either not published or no attention is paid to. But what happened in the 2 or 3 years after 2001 is that over that 2-year period, something like half of the Labor Party paid membership drifted away from the party. In fact, of people most closely involved with the Labor Party, either by membership or professional association, about 50% of them did not vote for Labor in the year 2001, and most of them have not voted for the Labor Party with their first preference since. Anyway, Don Watson, reflecting on that, sort of commented on the fact that if Labor had gone moral in 2001, they would have suffered a defeat worse than they suffered, and it was a pretty bad defeat, I must say. But people would be clamouring to join the Labor Party immediately afterwards. But instead of being a base for reorganisation, it became a base for further disintegration of the party. In any event, Whitlam devised a plan. It was called the Program. There are actually sort of somewhat National Socialist sort of aspects about it. People call Gough the leader and things like that. But But the thing about the Labor Party program that was devised in the late 1960s and which persisted and was harmonised further in the period 1969 to 1972 was that an enormous amount of work was done not just within the party but in the branches and in the electorate in explaining that Labor had a program, they had a plan, and that things fitted in with each other. So their health policies integrated with their education policies, with their Aboriginal affairs policies, and so on. This is not entirely strictly true. There was an awful lot of nonsense in the middle of Gough Whitlam's plan, but he had an awfully clever way of, if you like, of when any issue arose, of being able to address it in a way, if you like, that spoke a whole story and spoke of how this fitted in with that. It's what Paul Keating has in more recent times called the question of the narrative, the explanation, the description of why we're doing what we're doing. And it was also, if you like, the moral base of why people were getting involved in it. And why people were, if you like, invited to join a crusade to make things happen. Now, there was a lot of problems inside the Labor Party at that time. There was major strife that sort of persisted as a relic of the great split in the Labor Party between the groupers and the left wing during the 1950s. There was continuing brawls over other issues such as state party organisation and rorts and whatnot of the sort that we just couldn't imagine happening in the Labor Party today, and particularly focused in places such as Victoria and New South Wales. Gough Whitlam was almost invariably in tension with about 40% of his caucus, and at one point when he was exasperated with it and resigned, Jim Cairns came within 3 votes of defeating him. But which are sort of factors which people sometimes forget when they are all nostalgic about the Whitlam government. That it was a terribly raucous and disorganised lot, and that a major job, at the end of the day I have to say, nonetheless an unsuccessful job, was done by Whitlam in trying to rein them all in. But while history will probably judge that many aspects of the Whitlam years were a bit of a fiasco, people of my generation will think that they were a truly liberating experience that actually got us seriously involved in, not just in processes of social change and new policies adjusted from a long period, if you like, of cobweb and shadows, but also a time in which people were invited to think that they could change things, that they could affect things, that getting involved was worth it, that collective action, I don't mean collectivist action necessarily or socialist action necessarily, although in a sort of a way I do, but just that collective action by human beings could actually make some changes and could achieve some things. Over the period of the Whitlam government, the investment in education virtually doubled. We still, we have the legacy of that with us, all of us right now. The first serious attention was paid to Aboriginal affairs. There are people such as me who say and who wonder, you know, what was the right policy, what are we doing now, is it better? There's Waterford's law, which I claim copyright on, which I announced in the late Fraser days and only put it forward at that stage as a theorem waiting to be disproved by events, which was that every Minister for Aboriginal Affairs is worse than the last. And I'm prepared at this stage now to put it forward as a solid law on the basis that I have yet to see an exception. Without a doubt.
Mal Bruff and Jenny Macklin.
What?
Mal Bruff and Jenny Macklin.
I rate Jenny Macklin as worse than Mal Bruff. A lot worse, actually. But from pretty much the bottom of the barrel. Actually, the best was not Mr. W.C. Wentworth. The best was probably Ian Viner. a man who in his day we vilified as the author of various compromises, not least Dukenbar and so forth. But in retrospect, a little bit like Malcolm Fraser, he doesn't seem like anything like as much of an indecent character as we thought at the time. And I might say that he was so moved and changed and affected by his period in Aboriginal affairs, as was, of course, Fred Chaney and to a degree Peter Boehm after him, that they've devoted most of their lifetime afterwards to working full-time in Aboriginal affairs, which says something of themselves. I don't see Jerry Hand, for example, doing that. He works instead for Indonesian casino, Mr. Lee. Sorry, why did I say that? When in November 1972 Gough Whitlam talked about land rights for Aborigines or the abolition of conscription, there were people who actually wept with joy. There were people, I remember Kep Enderby walking around the polling booths here, and the Labor Party was in such a happy situation in the ACT that it was actually cheerfully not funding, not helping, but encouraging about half a dozen independents to stand on issues such as abortion rights and Aboriginal affairs and whatnot. But Kep was inviting them all to the Labor Party celebration afterwards, and nearly everybody came. In fact, the party was so great that I think it sort of had to move to fresher venues. It was a much more modern atmosphere in 1975. Although that was the first time, if you like, that I actually developed a bit of a suspicion that Canberra was a little bit different in its perception of events, because it had always seemed to me clear as a journalist in 1975 that Labor was headed for a colossal defeat. But there were still some people here, including, I must say, some journalists, who just couldn't believe that the Australian people would be so stupid as to put in that awful Mr. Malcolm Fraser. Now, I've been around, as I say, long enough that I'm starting to agree with Bill Hayden, if you like, that the Australian people are generally not stupid and generally have got the election result right most of the time, most of my lifetime, and I'm pretty sure that they're going to get it right come September 15 or something like that, because if ever the current lot, if ever, a government deserved to be thrown out of power, for a phrase I think that was popularised by Julia Gillard called something like losing its way, we've pretty much reached that point now. I watched closely, and because the Canberra Times, if you like, is sort of quite professionally interested in the bureaucracy and the relationship between the political process and the public administration process, the ways in which governments have come in, taken control, seized the agenda and moved to do things. And as I say, I've witnessed at fairly close hand all of the changes of government that have occurred in my lifetime. And we're sort of getting used to them now. It's heresy for some people to hear it, but I don't think that on September 17 the bureaucracy is going to have much trouble adjusting to a new regime. I don't think that there's going to be much of a night at the long knives. I think that the bureaucracy will generally be fairly comfortable with the new government, and I think in most areas of government policy not very much is going to change, because much as we highlight some of the differences between the parties, rightly, we have an essentially bipartisan policy, differing only in some slight matters of emphasis. You know, the obvious contradiction to that is, say, the carbon tax, but the problem with that, as with the problem with so many of the Gillard government things, is that by the time it actually got onto the statute books, and I admire her gumption, obstinacy and persistence that made it happen, but she compromised and weakened it so much to deal with all the interests involved that it was scarcely worth dying for. And I suspect that the Australian people are going to judge Labor on this, not on the question of whether Julia lied to us, which I think is a complete canard and a distraction, but on the basis that if we were going to make this, quote, sacrifice, and most people are very unaware that any sacrifice has been made at all, something had to change and there was going to have to be some tangible result from it. And I don't think that the public is very satisfied with it. I think, likewise, that a lot of current Labor government achievements, and I'll come back to this in a bit in terms of it's the way or the program or, if you like, the moral basis of it, but falls into the thing that people can't actually get a grip on it or understand exactly what has happened or what has been achieved. Gillard, for example, tells us quite a bit about the fact that she's been an education minister. But apart from a few things with giving computers to every kid, which have nothing really to do with educational achievement, and about which there's quite a bit of ambiguous evidence about whether it improves anything or actually makes it worse, most people can't actually put a finger on anything physically that has changed or improved in education as a result of the government's investment. Nor would they be satisfied that something had improved or changed if suddenly we were 11th in the world instead of 17th in the world in maths achievement for 10-year-olds. Likewise, there have been achievements in hospitals policy and in some of the deals with the states, but it's another thing, if you like, which has been watered down, compromised, where the need to be able to say for PR or spin purposes that a great reform has been achieved has come to overwhelm anything that people could actually point to and say, this is now different in the Australian public health system or the Australian public hospital system. Now, I'm not just shifting into an attack on the Gillard government so much as using that as an illustration of the way that over 40 years of covering politics and starting, if you like, with Gough Whitlam, who was so good at doing this, I have seen political leaders on both sides of the fence who have been reasonably good at taking the public into their confidence and continually explaining and re-explaining and adjusting their explanations of saying, this is what we are doing, this is where we are going, this is what we mean to be achieving. Now, sometimes, if you like, there can be a light on the hill that we don't get towards. Sometimes you can actually take the public in your confidence and say, look, we've had to junk this because the revenue coming in has not been as good as we have wanted. But the public, if you like, has shared the sense of adventure, has understood where the government is going, why it is doing it, and why it is a good thing. And this is an area where I sort of think that the current government, despite its achievements, and despite, if you like, a fairly formidable record on the statute books and some developments, many of them sort of logical, whatnot, that have been made in public administration and so forth, but it just completely left the population by. I've seen some splendid politicians, I've seen some really sleazy politicians, I've seen some politicians who had a fabulous reputation but whom I completely despise. Bob Hawke would be very close to the top of that particular pile. But Bob Hawke had a special capacity, not just, if you like, to share with the population why he was doing things, but to connect with people and to explain why he was going and to explain it in a fairly earthly and Australian vernacular. But he also had a capacity that I think we're only really seeing now. Paul Keating was a part of this, that right through the 80s was a time of very significant economic change in Australia, where the economy was quite considerably restructured and where the public knew what was going on, didn't like it much, became in fact utterly sick of it, but yet consistently voted for parties, the Labor Party, that were offering more hardship, more blood, more sweat, more toil, at a time when opposition parties were promising tax cuts and suggesting that everything could be achieved with a lot less pain. And I think Hawker's got to get an awful lot of credit for that. Hawker's also got to get a lot of credit in a way that only John Howard, I think, has over the period got, for being an incredibly good chairman and director of the grand show, a person who almost all the time had a sense of proportion about everything. John Howard was a great politician as well. Like him or loathe him, and there's many people who loathe him, John Howard left his office with a clean desk every night and slept very soundly, went for a good solid constitutional walk every morning, and his boast, which he made most